Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're going to unpack a truly fascinating and honestly pretty turbulent period of modern history. We're looking directly at part 5 of John Perkins' eye-opening book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. We're zeroing in on this critical window from 1981 right up to 2004 because, according to the author, this is when a massive fundamental shift occurred in how the U.S. was building and maintaining a global empire. Perkins argues that the subtle systems of economic manipulation, the very systems he himself helped orchestrate, suddenly evolved into something much more overt and frankly much more violent. It's a gripping look at the intersection of economics, corporate power, and geopolitics, and it really frames how we view global politics today. To really understand this era, we have to start with a fundamental question. The entire premise of Perkins's early career as an economic hitman or an EHM was based on this very calculated system of debt and conditionalities. The playbook was simple: offer massive loans to developing nations for huge infrastructure projects, make absolutely sure that U.S. engineering firms got all the lucrative contracts, and basically leave the target country hopelessly in debt and politically compliant. Right? But what happens when that system fails? What actually happens when a foreign president just flat out refuses the loans, refuses the bribes, and stands up to the demands of this global corporatocracy? Well, according to the source material, the answer is incredibly dangerous. Now, what's really interesting about this comparison is seeing the striking parallels between two very different leaders who suddenly found themselves caught in the exact same crosshairs. On one side, you've got Jaime Roldós, the democratically elected president of Ecuador. Roldós ran on a fierce anti-oil platform, determined to stop foreign oil companies from just extracting and exploiting his country's resources. He even went so far as to expel a group called the Summer Institute of Linguistics because he accused them of colluding with the oil giants. Then, on the other side, you have Omar Torrijos of Panama. Torrijos was this highly popular figure who championed human rights and absolutely demanded that the United States honor the transfer of the Panama Canal back to Panamanian control. Both of these men fiercely defended their nation's sovereignty, and both of them, according to Perkins, incurred the intense wrath of the incoming Reagan administration and some massive corporate CEOs. Basically, they were leaders who simply could not be bought. What happens next is a genuinely chilling sequence of events. On May 24, 1981, Jaime Roldós died in a fiery airplane crash in southern Ecuador. The world was completely shocked, and many people down in Latin America immediately suspected foul play. Then, just over 2 months later, on July 31, 1981, Omar Torrijos' absolute worst nightmare, one he had actually confessed to his friends right after Roldós' death, came true. He, too, died in a plane crash. Now, the book points out that both of these incidents had all the classic markings of orchestrated assassinations. Perkins asserts, very clearly, that these crashes were not tragic accidents. Instead, he claims they were deliberate, violent responses to these leaders' unwavering resistance to U.S. corporate and political interests. To explain how these deaths happened, Perkins introduces a term that was thrown around within his former circles: the jackals. These are covert operatives, often affiliated with the CIA, who are basically called in when the economic hitmen fail. Think of it like this: if a leader like Roldós or Torrijos refuses the financial bribes and sidesteps the debt traps, the jackals step right out of the shadows to force a regime change. That means coups, or in these cases, assassinations. The author argues that the Reagan administration, with its very aggressive global strategy, marked a blatant, undeniable return of these jackals. The incredibly swift and consecutive deaths of Roldós and Torrijos, that was meant to send a terrifying, unmistakable message to any other world leader who was even thinking about stepping out of line. So while these massive geopolitical shockwaves are just rolling across Latin America, the source material pivots to show us the micro-level impact of this whole system. It begs the question, what does this terrifying machinery do to someone on the inside who suddenly wants out? Perkins himself was going through a profound crisis of conscience at this time. He had witnessed the HEM system firsthand, he absolutely knew the jackals were real, and he desperately wanted to expose the truth. But, as you can imagine, breaking ranks with a system this powerful comes with immediate, deeply personal, and terrifying consequences. Here is exactly how Perkins' own trajectory played out. Back in April of 1980, he abruptly quit his position as a highly paid partner at the consulting firm Maine. His grand plan was to write a book exposing this entire EHM network to the world. But almost immediately after he started writing, the phone calls started. He received terrifying, anonymous death threats, and they specifically targeted his infant daughter, Jessica. He knew exactly what the jackals were capable of, so this wasn't just idle talk to him. Right on the heels of these threats, he was approached by a major engineering firm called Stone Webster, and they came to him with an incredibly lucrative offer. They offered him a retainer, literally 3 times his previous salary, simply to be an expert consultant on their roster. He wouldn't be doing any international EHM work. In fact, he really wouldn't have to do much of anything at all. This quote right here really captures the intense moral weight of his situation. He writes, "I was selling out again." Now, Perkins is careful to emphasize that this consulting contract wasn't a bribe in the strict legal sense of the word, right? It was actually a pretty standard industry practice to keep a big name on a corporate roster. But practically and morally, he understood exactly what it was. It was hush money. The overwhelming fear for his daughter's life, combined with the incredibly strong allure of immense financial security, effectively bought his silence for decades. It's a really powerful illustration of how the corporatocracy maintains its secrets. It's this calculated carrot and stick approach, perfectly legal financial rewards mixed with a dark underlying threat of violence. Let's move to and see how this builds, because this strategy of coercion on a personal level actually perfectly mirrored a massive macro-level shift in U.S. strategy as we headed into the late 80s and 90s. Prior to this era, the strategy for empire building was by and large covert. You send in the economic hitman with the debt traps. If that fails, you quietly send in the covert jackals. But what happens when both the EHMs and the jackals fail? Or what happens when the political optics suddenly require a massive show of force? As Perkins details, the strategy shifted dramatically from the shadows straight into the spotlight. The corporatocracy began relying on direct military invasion and massive, overt force to achieve its goals. The main catalyst for this overt shift brings us right back to Panama. After the death of Omar Torrijos, Manuel Noriega took power. Now, let's be clear. Perkins does not paint Noriega as a hero here. He actually notes that Noriega totally lacked Torrijos' charisma and integrity. However, Noriega committed the ultimate sin against the corporatocracy. He simply stopped playing by Washington's rules. Not only did he insist that the U.S. honor the canal treaty they had signed, but he also started exploring financing with Japan to build a brand new canal. For the U.S. administration, the idea of losing control of the canal to a fully independent Panama that was backed by Japanese money was an absolutely 100% unacceptable scenario. The response to Noriega's defiance was completely unprecedented. On December 20, 1989, the Bush administration launched a massive military assault on Panama. Perkins points out that this was an unprovoked attack on a civilian population that posed literally zero threat to the United States. Instead of just using a covert jackal to remove Noriega, which, by the way, Perkins suspects would have been pretty easily possible since Noriega's bodyguards were actually U.S. trained, the U.S. chose to unleash overwhelming military force. They allegedly set fire to entire neighborhoods and killed innocent civilians just to capture one single man. All of this to ensure the U.S. retained its iron grip on the canal region, and of course, to send a terrifying message to the rest of the world. So the crucial point is that this isn't just one author's radical perspective. Perkins actually brings in some strong external validation here, citing the journalist Peter Eisner, who investigated this invasion deeply. Eisner ultimately concluded that Noriega did not represent any real threat to U.S. national security. He called the invasion an abominable abuse of power at the expense of unconscionable bloodshed. For both Perkins and Eisner, the true underlying tragedy of the invasion was that it was allegedly less about some righteous rescue mission for democracy and entirely about securing corporate and political dominance. The tragic success of that overt strategy in Panama set a very dark precedent for the future. It proved that the administration could use direct, overwhelming military force, frame the whole thing as a heroic fight against an evil dictator, and the American public would largely support it. And this leads us directly to Iraq. By the late 1980s, Saddam Hussein was also completely refusing to buy into the economic hitman scenario. When Saddam invaded Kuwait in 1990, the Bush administration, newly emboldened by how well the Panama invasion played out, eagerly launched the Gulf War. Basically, when economic manipulation failed to control Iraq's vast oil resources, open warfare became the accepted go-to tool of the empire. And this brilliantly illustrates a truly horrifying reality of this entire systemic shift. Even the failures of the EHM system were successfully monetized. Think about it. Invasions offer massive, immediate profits for weapons manufacturers and defense contractors. And then, when the dust finally settles, Wall Street and those very same engineering firms, like the ones Perkins used to work for, swoop in and reap billions in contracts to rebuild the exact same infrastructure the military just blew up. War, in this cynical view, is simply another highly profitable vehicle for the corporatocracy to consolidate its wealth and force mass privatization on a global scale. Wow, okay, we've covered a tremendous amount of ground today, looking at the source material's intense analysis of how global dominance shifted from these covert debt traps and jackals straight into overt military invasions. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with the core provocative question that John Perkins asks his readers to really sit with. Have we fundamentally transitioned from a republic that defends democratic ideals into a global empire driven solely by the financial interests of a corporatocracy? It is a heavy question, for sure, but it forces us to look critically at the modern history we think we know and the true motives driving these massive geopolitical events. Keep questioning, keep learning, and thank you so much for joining me to explore this incredibly complex topic.